Chapter 7. All is Not Well. To Nancy Drew, her father's "we'll see" was as good as outright consent that she should accompany him to the home of Asa Sidney. Carson Drew dearly loved to pretend at being mysterious. So it happened that bright and early the next morning, father and daughter were speeding southward on the county highway, Nancy at the wheel of her snappy little roadster. In a short time they reached the Twisted Candles, which proved to be as inviting by daylight as it had been in the gloom of a stormy afternoon. "That is the tower room up there," Nancy pointed out. "And there is Sadie sweeping the porch." Sadie looked up as the car swung into the driveway and dropped her broom. She ran forward to greet Nancy and acknowledged the introduction to Mr. Drew with natural charm. "Mr. Sidney is expecting you," she said. "You'll show your father the way up, won't you, Nancy? I must hurry with my work." "Indeed I will," Nancy said, opening the door. Then she leaned toward Sadie and whispered, "Stay where I can find you. I'll be down in a minute." Sadie smiled her agreement, and Nancy entered the hallway where Mr. Drew was waiting. She led the way directly upstairs. "A pretty girl, Sadie," her father said, "but woefully thin to be doing heavy work. She is no advertisement for the food served here." "Mr. Sidney owns the building and lets Mr. and Mrs. Semmet have it for a tea room and inn," Nancy explained. "They are Sadie's foster parents. Here we are." She rapped at the door of Asa Sidney's tower room, and the old man's voice bade them enter. "Aha! I can't confuse you with a musty old painting this bright morning, my dear," Mr. Sidney smiled. "Mr. Drew, how are you, sir? Please excuse me for not rising, but I am somewhat weak this morning after a tempestuous night. Won't you draw up a chair?" "Don't disturb yourself, Mr. Sidney," the lawyer said, placing his bulging briefcase on the table from which the party had supped the night before, and drawing a chair close to the old man's seat. "I wish to make a new will," Mr. Sidney said simply. "Please understand at the outset that, despite my perhaps dowdy surroundings, I am prepared to meet your fee. I want the best legal advice, and I can afford to pay for it." Nancy stepped quietly from the room and closed the door behind her. "I know enough about the law business to realize that no third persons are wanted at a time like this," she told herself. It was a sober-minded Nancy who started slowly down the tower stairs. The making of a will was a solemn business, and Nancy could not help thinking that a man who had already passed his 100th year could not hope to live much longer. She paused on the first step to glance at the view unfolded through the windows opposite the landing. A corner of an old carriage shed was visible, and beyond that the edge of a small forest that grew denser and taller as it stretched toward the horizon. "That must be the woods through which we scooted in the storm last night," she mused. A movement below attracted her attention, and Nancy was immediately alert. She recognized Frank Semmet, Sadie's foster father, now dressed in overalls. He was carrying a shovel and a large basket, which seemed to be extraordinarily heavy. Perhaps he has been digging potatoes, Nancy thought. Yet, if he had been digging something, he'd be coming toward the house, not going away from it. No, he must be going to bury something, and something he doesn't want seen. Automatically, Nancy's mind deduced the meaning of Semmet's activities, which to an untrained observer would have been dismissed as some unimportant chore. Semmet paused close to the shed, which Nancy knew from the lay of the land to be at the end of the property farthest from the road. The man looked about him, studied the windows of the house carefully, and then began to dig with speed and fervor. That man is up to something dishonest, Nancy decided. He is trying to hide something. The hole satisfied Semmet before it was much more than 18 inches deep and about as big around. He reached into the basket and took out a box, and Nancy gasped when she saw it. It was unmistakably one which she had seen in Asa Sidney's room the preceding night. The box was about a foot square and 8 or 10 inches in depth, made of ebony and strengthened by brass straps and studs of the same material. It had been under one of the chairs Nancy had moved the night before, and she remembered dragging the heavy little box against the wall near the door so no one would trip over it. At the time, she had believed the chest to contain some of the materials with which Asa Sidney carried on his experiments. Evidently, its contents were far more valuable. Semmet dropped the box into the hole and dragged some bleached logs over it from the woodpile nearby. Then he very carefully scooped up all the earth dug from the hole, put it into his basket, and vanished toward the house with his strange load. It was now all but impossible to detect that anyone had been digging near the shed. "There is more going on at this place than anyone knows," Nancy said to herself as she proceeded downstairs. "And unless I am very much mistaken, Mr. Sidney is the victim of more than one attempt to get his wealth." Sadie emerged from a guest chamber on the second floor, where she had been waiting and listening for Nancy's descent. "Hello," she said in a subdued voice. Nancy sensed that Sadie had something to tell her, but did not know just how to begin. So she decided to give the girl an opening. "Mr. Sidney must have changed his mind very suddenly about his will," she said. "Hush!" Sadie whispered, looking cautiously about. "I did not say anything to Father or Mother Semmet about it. Oh, Nancy, I'm so worried and upset. I should not be disloyal to the Semmets, for after all, I owe everything to them." "What do you mean, Sadie?" Nancy asked, drawing the girl closer to her. "Oh, I wish I could get it all straight in my mind," Sadie sighed. "I love old Mr. Sidney. He is so friendless and pathetic. Last night, just after you left, a man came to see him. I know him. He is some sort of relative and has been here before, usually late at night. A little while later, another man came, who has also visited Mr. Sidney, even oftener than the other caller, although they have never been here together before. In a little while, the most terrible argument broke out between the two callers. We could hear them shouting, though we were way downstairs in the kitchen. Father Semmet crept upstairs and listened outside the door, I know. The arguments would die down and then break out again more violently than ever. After about an hour, the second caller left. He caught Father Semmet eavesdropping and scolded him terribly. A few minutes later, the other man left, slamming the doors behind him. Poor Mr. Sidney! No wonder he said he had had a tempestuous night, Nancy said. Do you know that the two men are mixed up in a family feud? The first one is related to Mr. Sidney's wife, who left him, and the second is a relative of Mr. Sidney. I never heard about that, Sadie said. I'll tell you about it in detail when we have a chance, Nancy promised. Go on with your story. Father Semmet was very angry at having been discovered, and when he came downstairs, he ordered me to bed. Sadie continued. I could hear Mr. Sidney pacing the floor, so I went up to see if I could be of any help to him. He said to me, No, Sadie, the only way you could help me right now would be to summon the best lawyer in the state, and I know you don't know him. Neither do I. So I told him about Mr. Drew, and he asked me to make an appointment with your father. I did it secretly. Oh, Nancy, I can't tell you. Never mind then. You must do as you think best, Nancy counseled. What will Mr. and Mrs. Semmet think of Mr. Sidney's caller, though? Mother Semmet is away for the morning, Sadie explained. She has walked through the woodlot to the McIntosh farm to select some broiler chickens. Father Semmet gave orders he was not to be disturbed. He is working out in the garage, making some repairs on our car. Won't Mrs. Semmet be home soon? Nancy asked. Indeed, she is home. The two girls shrank back as the harsh voice of Mrs. Semmet fell upon their ears. To Sadie's horror and Nancy's surprise, the innkeeper's wife emerged from an adjoining room, clad in a spotted dressing gown, her long hair uncoiled and a brush in her hand. You had better be more sure of my whereabouts the next time you start blabbing family secrets to strangers, miss. The irate woman thrust her scrawny neck out toward the frightened Sadie and waved the hairbrush menacingly. I heard every word you said, you impudent, deceitful, snippy little foundling brat, the woman screamed. And as for you, young lady, gossiping with this simple-minded child, I'll settle with you for that this minute. End of chapter 7.